Okay, so as mentioned in the last video, capitalism really took off in the late 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. But even though it led to a lot of wealth and prosperity for a lot of business owners and other high-skilled individuals, it also came with its problems. So while it increased the prosperity of some generations, the desire to make as much profit as possible often led to numerous issues because of a lack of government regulations. So essentially, business owners had one thing in their mind: profit, profits, profits. And that meant that often they would lead to them cutting costs whichever way they can. So often it led to poor working conditions because, again, they were trying to save costs. Often they were unhealthy, machines were dangerous, and there was a lack of safety for employees. Air quality was diminishing. Um, Businesses would often lay off workers if it meant more profit. So their incentive wasn't to provide for their workers; their incentive was to make money. Often workers didn't get wages that were, receive wages that were insufficient to provide for their families. Women and children were often forced to work long hours, and often made money just enough to survive. So while some got really rich, others were forced to work long hours for very little money with unsafe working conditions. So it led to exploitation, this survival of the fittest mentality. Those who can't compete often failed. So small businesses often failed to compete with larger businesses and went out of business. There was no minimum wage or safety net for unskilled workers, which meant that they often got paid very little and struggled to survive. So what happened, what we started to see in the late 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, was that markets became less and less free. So wages started to rise. Often businesses would the government would inflict things like the minimum wage, um, and often it led to more government intervention. So often in some businesses there became a lack of competition because what happened was the big companies often were able to charge higher prices. They were able to collude together to increase their prices. We'll talk about what that means in a later video. And countries often started to adopt protectionist measures, so to try and stop the threat of imports. So they would put tariffs or taxes on foreign products, with the idea being that um, the individuals would buy their products as opposed to cheaper foreign products. So tariffs and taxes on imports would encourage you to buy locally. So in the later part of the 19th century, workers started to revolt and they started to fight for improved working conditions and a larger share of the big profits the companies were making. So unions started to be developed. So unions are basically groups which protect workers' rights. So there's teachers' unions, ambulance unions, unions in the mining, manufacturing. So all these parties started to be established, trade unions and socialist parties formed to try and increase the rights of workers. So we had things like established like minimum wages, pensions for older workers, unemployment benefits. These things became more and more prevalent in the late 19th century, early 20th century to try and protect those workers, or not even workers, but individuals in society that weren't able to generate an income or weren't able to generate a sufficient income. In October 1917, the Russian communists abolished capitalism in Russia and started to switch private and sort of banned all private ownership. So all economic decisions were decided that they were better off with all economic decisions on what to produce and how to produce being left to the government rather than the free market. So the invisible hand of the market, which basically means that demand and supply determine what is produced, they went away from that and said the government will now choose projects that they feel are in the economy's best interest. So the focus was on producing what was needed, with no capitalists enjoying huge profits. The idea being that no one was exploited and wealth was shared more evenly, but it also led to a lack of profits, which can hurt creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship. So the plan was to make things fairer, but it often led to decreased wealth because there was that disincentive to work. So it often led to inequalities, often because the government took more than their fair share as well. So in the Soviet Union, you don't need to know a lot about the Soviet Union, but they had these 5-year plans with the idea being that they would put in place what they planned to produce for the next 5 years. But often there was too much money spent on, or too many resources, allocated towards industrial production, and that led to a lack of agriculture, which led to shortages, which means people didn't have enough food to survive. It often led to, and if you remember that game we played in class with the pencils and the candy, prices wouldn't adjust to reflect consumers' demands. So it often led to them not producing what consumers wanted in the right quantities, which meant that there were big shortages of certain products and surpluses of other products. So between 1948 and 1968, there was this big sort of rivalry between the capitalist America and the communist Soviet Union, and their aim was to try and influence the rest of the world. That's what the Cold War was all about. So many underdeveloped countries who had experienced famine and poverty because of capitalism started to think that the communist ideologies were better. However, in sort of the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Soviet Union started to fail, and it became clear that communism wasn't the way to go, and it was incapable of producing the wide range of goods and services that people wanted. So eventually, capitalism kind of won the battle in 1991, and that was seen through the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which separated communist West Germany, so communist East Germany, with capitalist West Germany. So the fall of the Berlin Wall was really synonymous of that idea of the demise of communism and the move towards capitalism. The Great Depression, um, which happened in 1929, was sort of called the crisis of capitalism. So as the share market crashed and people lost lots and lots of money, that's when people started to feel like communism might be a better alternative, and communist ideologies became more and more popular. So the 20th century did come with a rise of what we call socialist principles, particularly in the earliest part of the 20th century, because they believed that capitalism was the best way to generate wealth, but it wasn't sharing wealth equally. So socialism, and we'll talk more about what socialism means in the next video, but it gained more and more power from the masses. And essentially what people sort of came to the conclusion was that capitalism and communism are both not purely effective in allocating resources, so we need a mix between the two. So with mainly private ownership, but with the government stepping in to provide things like old age pensions, unemployment benefits, public housing, public services, and things like that. So one of the great issues of the 20th century was how much should the government intervene? Should they leave the economy to its own devices, or should they intervene more? Right-wing citizens, so you might hear people called right-wings, are generally advocates for less government intervention. So they're the kind of people that believe in the free market. They also believe in sort of not having gun laws for guns and things like that. Those on the left wanted more government intervention and greater equality in a fairer society, even if it came at the expense of generating slightly less wealth because there was less incentive to work hard. Left-wing supporters generally won the argument in the early or middle part of the 20th century, but there's been a move towards more right-wing philosophies in the later part of the 20th century. So Donald Trump, for example, being elected is potentially a move towards more right-wing ideologies. I might skip that. So, summary, regardless of the system used, scarcity exists in all countries, regardless of how much money countries have, because there's unlimited wants and needs compared to limited resources. Market economies make decisions based on the individuals at a decentralized level, where centrally planned economies determine what's produced mainly at the government level. In market economies, production and distribution is left to individuals and businesses. Suppliers of goods and services are motivated by profit and respond to consumers' demands. Last, I'm going to finish off this video with some strengths and weaknesses of each economic system. So starting with strengths of each of them, and this is really important for your extended response question that you're going to be answering later in term 2, or early in term 2, sorry. So strengths of market capitalism, generally consumers' demands are satisfied because self-interest producers produce what consumers want because that's how they make a profit, and they only do this by working hard at producing the goods and services that consumers value. Markets generally produce the correct amount of things because when there's an increase in demand for products, there's a shortage, so prices will increase and producers will shift more resources to making those products, which helps to satisfy consumers' wants and needs. There's generally a lot of competition, although not always, which provides a great incentive to maximize productivity and reduce prices. On the flip side, some strengths, actually, I'll just come back to this slide. Other strengths of market capitalism: firms have a great incentive to be productive because they want to keep their profits high and remain competitive. There's no minimum wage, so firms' production costs are down. Consumers can produce what they want in the correct quantities. There's a great variety of goods and services as well. There's some of your key strengths of capitalism. Lots of variety, high incentive to be productive. They generally produce what consumers want. There's generally lower prices, and generally consumers' demands are satisfied. In terms of planned socialism, some of the key benefits are that the working class are not exploited, so everyone's basic needs are met in theory, and there shouldn't be huge inequalities in the distribution of income. Resources should be used to produce the products that society wants, but are in the best interest of society. So things that are going to maximize the living standards of society are in theory produced. Everyone has access to basic things, education, food, necessities. That's a real strength of planned socialism, that everyone gets access to the basic goods and services. They serve the collective rather than individuals, and wealth is distributed more evenly than in a market capitalist society. In terms of weaknesses, so some of the weaknesses of market capitalism is that resources can be depleted quickly because everyone's interested in the profit motive. It can often lead to unsustainable production. So people will cut down, forests, for example, if they want the timber, that'll generate profits. Firms will emit carbon dioxide if it helps them to produce more, which will then lead to climate change. So one problem is the impact on the environment. The lack of government intervention can lead to a bigger gap between the rich and the poor, so often high Gini coefficients or high the inequitable distribution of income. Often workers will be exploited by greedy businesses looking to maximize their profits. Smaller businesses often struggle to survive because they can't take advantage of the same things that bigger businesses can. Certain products will be overproduced, like that are in demand, like drugs and alcohol. All these things that are really harmful for society can potentially be overproduced as well. Other things will not be produced, so things like healthcare, education, so public schools wouldn't be around, so we wouldn't be enough access to education and healthcare. Um, it can lead to consumerism, so people trying to satisfy their endless needs and wants. There's not enough resources allocated to public goods, which we'll talk about more a bit later. Everyone's basic needs are not necessarily met, which means there might be high levels of poverty and greed within society as well. So to summarize, high levels of inequality, not everyone's needs are met. Some things are underproduced, like schools and education. Some things are overproduced, like drugs and alcohol. Many businesses will struggle to survive because of the high level of competition. Large income inequality, resource depletion are some of the main problems you'll see with market economies. In terms of planned socialism, generally, producers don't work as hard because they don't have the profit incentive. So if you remember the video with Cuba, there's often a lot of wasted resources. People generally get paid a similar amount regardless of their efforts, which can lead to them not working to their potential. Labour resources not allocated to their optimal ends. Often people have less incentive to study and train because they're going to get a similar income anyway, so they may not work as hard as they would in a capitalist society. A big problem is prices don't respond as efficiently as they would. So because you're planning ministers, so if you remember when the two people went outside, can't remember who it was, but we made them look silly when we had the pencils and the candy, they're not as effective at responding to consumers' demands. This can lead to surpluses and shortages of goods and services because we don't possess all the available information. The poor can suffer in planned socialist economies because often the size of the economy is smaller. So even though they distribute resources equally, often there's less to go around because there's less incentive to work. There's less incentive for innovation and new ideas to maximize productivity and output. It can often lead to corruption among state planners. So often the government will keep more money for themselves. And that happened a lot with in the Soviet Union, for example. And it can often lead to famines because resources are not enough resources allocated to certain areas because 5-year plans have been established which don't take into account people's demands for certain products. Thanks.